Okay, lovely. So welcome everybody to this session, which, as I mentioned before in the introduction during the first hour, I'm really pleased to welcome Yoshi Kato from Japan. He's an amazing person, an excellent academic and researcher, and also I think, as I mentioned, a big influencer and a person who really did a lot to connect Japan with China, to understand China, and to, from that academic and also social political perspective, to support social change. Um, that's why I also invited him to be a curator, a member of Global Change Center. So I'm going to introduce him very briefly to him. One of the reasons why I invited him today is because he's just about to release, or just released, a new book that is entitled Why China Will Not Democratize. So I hope that in this half an hour, he will share something about this book. And also, I think you're writing, Yosi, now, another book, which is called Beijingnization, The Destiny of Hong Kong and the National Strategies of the National Chinese Communist Party, which is also a lot about the debate on, universal rights, the political developments in China, in Asia, and the implications for the world. Yosi is a research fellow of the Rakuten Securities Economic and Research Institute, and I met him when he was a associate professor at the Asia Global Institute. He writes, and he's a fellow for a lot of different institutions, super recognized in the United States as well, and he normally, you will see him speaking in CNN and many other medias, writing for the New York Times, etc. So it's super wonderful to have you here, Yosi. Thank you so much. Uh, and we are really looking forward to listen to you. And as I said, hopefully to have a very good interaction towards the end of your conversation presentation, so we can learn from your experience. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Cecilia. It's a great honor to join this session. And actually, I've been to Rio a couple of years ago, and that was very impressive. And I went to a lot of places to feel what is Brazil, what is the power of diversity in Brazil, unlike Japan. And now I'm here near Tokyo. And now Japan is trying to contain the coronavirus at the same time to recovering the economy, and then eventually successfully host the Olympic, receiving the baton from Rio last time. So I think it's a very critical moment for Japan as well. And I'm very glad to see a kind of a connection between Brazil and Japan. And when I went to visit Brazil, like Sao Paulo, Rio, I could feel a lot of connection with Japan. So now, so that is why it's a great pleasure to join the session as a Japanese. But today's topic is maybe all about China. And Cecilia, what the topic Cecilia
can I check something?
Implications of increasing
Yosi,
global power.
Can I check? Yosi, sorry to interrupt you. Can I check that everyone is listening okay? Because I personally listen a little bit low, the sound. How are you listening? Can you put the thumbs up if you're listening fine?
Quite good, quite good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to check that before you start. So please start again with the topic of your presentation. Thank you.
Alrighty, I have to start at the beginning, from the beginning, right?
Not about what you said about Rio
or
Brazil, just focus of your topic.
Okay. So, although I am Japanese, but I've been in China, basically in Beijing for more than 10 years. And then, moved to US and Hong Kong. And actually my basic major is about Chinese politics and US-Japan-China relations in the Asia-Pacific. And so, today's topic is quite good for me. And the topic which Cecilia gave me is the implications of increasing global power of China and the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific and the world, impact and prospect. And this is what Cecilia gave me. So I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And hopefully my presentation could be useful and helpful for your understanding on Asia and beyond. So I'm going to present my topic from three parts. One is China. The part one would be China as major power. China as major power. China is increasingly becoming major power, regionally and globally. And actually, you know, we can look at like BRICS, right? And it's a very important mechanism, including Brazil and as well as China. And part two will be, will China democratize? Of course, I'm going to say no. Will China democratize? I think China's political development will be very critical for future international relations as well as human beings even. So I think it's quite important to focus on China's domestic politics. And the third part would be implication to international relations. I think we have to figure out what's the correlation between China's domestic politics and its implication to international relations. For example, now we can look at the US-China strategic rivalry. You know, this is much more than Trump administration. Now Biden administration, actually, I visited the United States last month, and I had a chance to talk with some officials in the White House or, you know, State Department, and actually basically anti-China, a very strong, tough countermeasure for China has become a kind of consensus in Washington, D.C. So this is much more than Trump, including Biden. A lot of US scholars, now they are trying to face to the rise of China very critically. So why? The problem is why? US-China strategic rivalry. In my understanding, this is more than economic, more than diplomatic, more than military, but political confrontation, ideological struggle. So this would affect the discourse of human beings. So I think this is quite important. So three parts. Let me present my views within 30 minutes from now on. So part one would be China as major power. You know, I think Brazil is a major country, big country. Japan, I don't know, unlikely. But you know, China is obviously major power. But as I introduced, I studied my undergraduate in Beijing, School of International Studies at Beijing University. At that time, back to 2000s, around 2005 or so, at that time, my teachers told us major power diplomacy. What does major power diplomacy mean for China? At that time, teacher, Beijing University, one of the best universities in China, they told us this is the diplomacy, China's diplomacy with major powers. China's diplomacy with major powers, such as United States, Russia, maybe including Japan. But anyway, at that time, 2000, at that time, you know, the Chinese president was Hu Jintao. Hu Jintao. Maybe you guys have heard this name, Hu Jintao. At that time, for China, the major power diplomacy means diplomacy with major powers. But now it's Xi Jinping's year. Maybe you guys understand who is Xi Jinping. But now we are looking at the great reorientation, the great redefinition on major power diplomacy. Now for China, major power diplomacy means diplomacy adds major power. Diplomacy adds major power. So this is a great shift, much more than conceptualization. This is substantial. So China is rising up as a major power. China is becoming a center in the global politics as a major power. So this is economic. This is diplomatic. And now we know China is conducting BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. China has established an AIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And China is becoming a bigger country and expanding its influence beyond the region, more than Asia Pacific. So This is very important understanding what is China. So China as major power, China as major power. So previously, maybe you guys know Deng Xiaoping, Deng Xiaoping emphasized a low profile. We should be low profile and then be pragmatic, So we need to stabilize the relation with major powers like Russia, United States, and Japan. But maybe sometimes you have to sacrifice your your dignity, because you are poor, you are not that strong. That is why you have to prioritize the stable relationship with major powers. But now time is different. So China is rising up economically, militarily, even politically. This is my basic understanding of China, and this is exactly happening under Xi Jinping's new era. Xi Jinping, he's a strong guy, basically no enemies in the party, in the Chinese Communist Party. And maybe you guys know Xi Jinping has already abolished his term limit as president. So actually, Xi Jinping could be the top leader as president, the party secretary general, and chairman of military eternally. So this is possible, theoretically speaking. So Xi Jinping is quite strong, and this, in my words, now China is conducting internally repressive and externally assertive policies under Xi Jinping's era as a major power. And very interestingly, in my theory, what is major power diplomacy under Xi Jinping's era? My understanding is this. First, economic expansion. You are using your economic power in domestic and converting it to international influence, like AIB. Now, if we go to Southeast Asia, they are looking at China's investment, huge investment. Oh, this is a very good deal of economics. And then convert it to political penetration. Number two, political penetration. China is expanding its influence politically. And now, some scholars in the United States, they are talking about sharp power. Now China is penetrating in the campus, penetrating in the think tank or media in the United States, like using maybe China Daily, Xinhua agencies, these external propaganda. And this is more than economic but political. And then China is creating a friendship. What is the major power diplomacy? I would say this is Xi Jinping's diplomacy. In other words, this is friendship creation diplomacy. China needs friends. China needs a lot of friends, maybe including Brazil. So what is friends? You should respect us. You should respect our core interests. What is core interest for China? Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang Uyghur, South China Sea, East China Sea, Tibet. These are China's core interests, which Chinese Communist Party would never ever compromise. You have to resolve by any ways. This means core interests for China. So I basically presented this, graphic: economic expansion, political penetration, friendship creation, and protection of core interests. This is basically graphic of what means China's major power diplomacy. And then now, including Brazil, we are facing COVID-19. I think COVID-19 is a great case for testing what is China's major power diplomacy. I think, at the beginning, back to more than a year ago, the first case of coronavirus happened in Wuhan city in China, right? Of course, this is controversial. China has never acknowledged, the first case has happened from Wuhan, but the source of virus is not necessarily from Wuhan. This should be examined scientifically. This is what Chinese government said. Okay, here I'm not going to touch, which one is right or wrong, no. But the problem is, at the beginning, a year ago, China had faced a kind of national crisis. Chinese Communist Party was concerned, economic downturn, social unrest, and international isolation, because the case was happening from China for the first time. So, Chinese government was very upset at the time. That meant national crisis. But now, the Chinese government converted the national crisis into strategic opportunities. Strategic opportunities. Maybe one background is now looking at the US, looking at India, looking at Europe, even Japan. Actually, their performance is, much worse than China. China contained the virus much more successfully. And now looking at Chinese economy, the first quarter, 18 plus 18.3% growth. And maybe, according to IMF, International Monetary Fund, this year Chinese economy would grow by more than 8%. So China basically, now from the current situation, say, China successfully contained the coronavirus and then recovering the economy. And now China is expanding its influence globally. So I would say China very successfully converted its national crisis to strategic opportunity compared to the United States, for the strategic rivalry for China. And very interestingly, my assessment is this. This is Xi Jinping's major power diplomacy. Xi Jinping's major power diplomacy will see China increasingly taking advantage of the pandemic to try to engage in standard setting, not only responding passively, but standard setting and rule making for global governance. This is quite important. And this is, I am not saying without evidence. Looking at Zhao Lijian, the spokesperson of Chinese Foreign Ministry, he, in the press conference, he mentioned March 5th, 2020. He said like this: China's signature strength, efficiency, and speed in this fight against pandemic, has been widely acclaimed. And he said, China set a new standard for the global effort against the epidemic. Chinese spokesperson said, China set a new standard for the global efforts against the epidemic. So this means a lot. Previously, what we felt about China is, China is a huge economy. It's a large population. China is big, and Chinese people is very, diligent, right? Very smart. A lot of students in the United States, right? This is our impression on China, but now it's different. China is not only rising economically, but China is trying to engage in setting standard, as we discussed previously, like, WTO, WHO, rule and value-based order, international order, democratization, the rule of law, freedom of speech. These are, principle and norm for human beings. But now, very, very importantly seeing, China is engaging strongly in setting standard, engaging in global governance with Chinese characteristics rather than general sense. This is the first point. This is the basic fundamental essence of Xi Jinping's major power diplomacy. Let me move forward to number 2. Will China democratize? It's a great honor to hear Cecilia's introduction of my new book. I'm going to publish why China will not democratize, the political development and prospects in the Xi Jinping's new era. Here, I am from Japan. I was born and grew up in Japan. And then when I was 18 years old, I moved to Beijing. So I have to recognize there are a lot of different forms and implementation of democracy. There are different democracies in Japan, United States, Brazil, India, Taiwan, South Korea, a lot of different democracies, particularly in practice. It's quite different. Japan had learned basically from United Kingdom, parliamentary democracy. And actually our prime minister, our top prime minister just visited the United States to see President Biden. Our prime minister is not elected by our constituency directly, indirectly. He is elected indirectly. But looking at Taiwan or United States, it's a presidential and much more direct than Japan. But even in the US, how the US voters choose US president, the process is very controversial. People say it is not fair, right? So actually, democracy is always in progress. I believe it's as well in Brazil too. When I visited Brazil, I joined. It's a huge protest in São Paulo. It's like anti-free drug or something like that. Anyway, it's a kind of symbol of democracy. But anyway, in Brazil, India, US, Japan, democracy is always in progress. It is not unchangeable. We have to push forward with joint efforts to democratize democracy. I think it's quite important. But here I have to say, even though we should recognize there are different kinds of democracy, but we have to find out some common sense. Otherwise, we can't discuss what is democracy. And here, let me present 3 basic factors of democracy. If this country or this political system does not include these 3 factors, I would say you are not democratic. One is relatively free and frequent election. Number 2, freedom of speech. Third, the rule of law. Your judicial system is independent. So these 3 factors should be basic and fundamental factors for democracy. Otherwise, in my theory, I wouldn't say you are democratic. In this sense, given my experiences and analysis on China, I have to say China is not democratic. China is not democratic. That is okay. We cannot say democracy is perfect. Democracy is right. No. Authoritarian system, even dictatorship, looking at North Korea, right? Under Kim Jong-un, they survived very, toughly. And China, since the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976, China has very successfully survived and developed its own economy and country, and removed poverty. And actually, they contributed a lot for international prosperity. So we have to respect different political system, right? We cannot say morally you are right, you are wrong. No, I am not buying that. But here, what is important is which kind of democracy are you going to have, right? And in this sense, China has never thought we are a democratic country. I'm tracking Xi Jinping, Chinese government, their understanding and statements on democracy. They have never ever denied you are democracy. I mean, I am democratic. We have our own democracy. This is China's statement. But here, fairly speaking, we have to recognize, okay, you could have your own democracy, but your democracy is with Chinese characteristics rather than universal value, based on universal value or general sense. I think today I prepared very interesting material. Maybe you guys have heard Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, Wang Yi. Wang Yi participated in the dialogue with the US Council on Foreign Relations based in New York. This is a very, where Cecilia worked before. In the New York City, there is a very influential think tank named as Council on Foreign Relations. The president named Richard Haas. And Wang Yi participated in the discussion on US-China relations. And Wang Yi described what is democracy for China. This is quite interesting. So let me introduce it to you guys. Wang Yi said, China's socialist democracy is a whole process, most representative democracy. By the way, the dialogue happened on April 24th, just 4 days ago. So this is very latest. And he said, most representative democracy. He said, China's democracy is most representative, and said it embodies the will of the people, fits the country's realities, and is endorsed by the people. it is undemocratic in itself to label China as authoritarian or dictatorship simply because China's democracy takes a different from than that of the United States. This is what Wang Yi argued. Yeah, it sounds good. He recognized our democracy is different from the US, different implementation, different factors, but we have our own democracy. This is what Chinese leadership argued over democracy. But here I have to say, based on my analysis and observations on Chinese politics, China is pursuing a quite different path from so-called liberal democracy, particularly in Western countries, including Japan. I think China is allowed and qualified to have its own democracy. That's okay. But looking at Xi Jinping's policy, his very repressive policies on university, media, NGO, and China has never accepted, opposition parties. Looking at China's National People's Congress, China's Congress, eternally only yes, never no, right? So this is basically no political competitions. The Chinese Communist Party, that has more than 19 million party membership, and those guys are not elected by the people, but they can represent the people. So this is very much Chinese characteristics. Here, what is important is not opposing China, but we have to recognize China is rising up with very different political system. But the reality is China is rising up. China is engaged in global governance with Chinese characteristics. They have their own understanding on democracy. They have their own understanding with what is world peace. But the reality is we are looking at the rising China. So this is, I think, maybe one of the biggest challenges for human beings in 21st century. Maybe much more difficult than Soviet Union in 20th century, because China is, because previously I had a chance to work with Francis Fukuyama. Maybe you guys know Francis Fukuyama. He is Japanese American political scientist, and he a couple of decades ago he published The End of History. After the collapse of Soviet Union, he said, the liberal democracy and capitalism is the final form of human beings as a political system. But now, Francis should amend his own view, because China has not collapsed yet, right? China is pursuing its own development path as a socialist country, and China has never followed up Soviet Union, and China is still very influential, the second largest economy, the largest trader in the world. So we cannot ignore China, right? Whatever you are, democratic or undemocratic, but China is here. We have to look at that, right? So this is my argument in the part 2, and let me move forward to part 3. So what I argued, we are facing an undemocratic China, but China is strong. China is influential increasingly. And what is implication to international relations in Indo-Pacific? Actually, Cecilia gave me this word, Indo-Pacific, but China does not like Indo-Pacific. China does not like Indo-Pacific, this word, because what is Indo-Pacific? Quad. Have you heard Quad? 4 countries, Quad, Q-U-A-D, Quad. The United States, Japan, India, and Australia, 4 countries, Quad. And actually, when Biden administration established, the foreign minister from 4 countries of Quad, they met together in Tokyo, in person, and then talked about what should be Indo-Pacific region like. We should be open and democratic, stable and prosperous. And China had seen this as, or you are containing China. You say you are a democratic alliance, and your fundamental purpose is to contain the rise of China, the rise of socialist China. This is China's implementation. That's okay. That's okay. But Indo-Pacific is a little bit political. Maybe so. If we say Asia-Pacific would be more neutral or something like that. But but very interestingly speaking, now looking at the multilateral cooperation mechanism in the world, like Quad, what I said, Japan, US, India, and Australia, like BRICS, which the Goldman Sachs strategist defined, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa. BRICS is a very emerging market, right? BRICS, like G20, which includes Japan, China, and the United States, right? And RCEP, RCEP, have you heard? RCEP, this exactly equal to ASEAN plus 3, ASEAN, Southeast Asia Union, right? ASEAN plus 3, no, sorry, ASEAN plus 6, ASEAN plus Japan, China, South Korea, and India, New Zealand, and Australia. So now, anyway, what I want to say is now we are looking at the different kinds and types of multilateral cooperation. This is actually more than South-South cooperation. I even want to challenge, now there are no pure South-South cooperation, no pure South-South cooperation. This would be converged with some different kinds of cooperation form. For example, Quad. And China criticized Quad, your democratic alliance, which is seeking to contain China. But looking at the BRICS, Brazil, in my understanding, Brazil is very diversified, strong, emerging, and democratic country. Of course, Brazilian democracy is in progress, but Brazil is a democratic country. No any dispute. Every Japanese sees Brazil as democracy. Every Japanese. Brazil is a democratic country, right? Nobody opposes. And Russia, a bit controversial. India, yeah, the largest democratic country in the world, right? China, unlikely. South Africa, yeah, South Africa has experienced very difficult times over the years, but as a nation building, South Africa, it's not easy to reach the current status. But anyway, BRICS, within the BRICS, there are different countries, different political system, different history, right? And G20, of course, different. China in, India in, Japan, United States in, Europe in. It's basically, over diversified. It's quite difficult to get consensus on one issue. Much difficult than G7, because G7 is basically Western countries, maybe except for Japan. As a Japanese, I have never thought Japan is a Western country, but Japan respects democracy. Japan respects freedom, but a bit different from so-called Western countries. And RCEP or TPP, have you heard TPP? Trans-Pacific Partnership. Actually, very unfortunately, Mr. Donald Trump withdrew from TPP, but TPP previously led by US and Japan, and the highest standard, very inclusive free trade system based on value and ruled international order. And the US was in, Japan, like Chile, Peru, Singapore, Brunei, any Trans-Pacific Partnership. But China has never denied, I am going to join in the future. And maybe Taiwan, maybe South Korea, and now the United Kingdom is very interested in to join, and maybe Brazil in the future. But anyway, what I want to say is, in one platform, now we can include different countries, different political system. So this is, the reality of international relations. We cannot say this is, China versus the United States, democracy versus authoritarian, right? North versus South. No, the world is globalizing, right? But at the same time, nationalism is rising at the same time. So it's a very complicated situation. But back to Xi Jinping's politics, I think now China's internally repressive and externally assertive policies are pushing the rest of the world to relatively lose their trust and confidence on dealing with China. Actually, looking at China's performance in Hong Kong, in Taiwan and Xinjiang, I don't know how Brazilian friends are looking at Xinjiang's human rights issue. For Chinese government, they have never ever said this is not the problem of human rights. Okay, looking at Wang Yi's statement back to a couple of days ago, Wang Yi said the Xinjiang-related issues are not about human rights, ethnicity or religion. They are about fighting violent terrorism, separatism, and extremism. So, for Chinese government, Xinjiang has nothing to do with human rights, nothing to do with human rights. But maybe including Japan or some American friends or Brazilian friends, we would say this is related with human rights. This is related with religious freedom or something like that. So, and looking at Hong Kong, the city, I met Cecilia for the first time, and Hong Kong is very energetic, but based on freedom of speech, the rule of law, and limited political freedom. But what would be in the future? Now the Hong Kong's political climate is changing dramatically, and we say one country, two systems. Would it be consistent or not? We are talking about that from different angles. Some people are talking about from business. Some people are talking about human rights. It's okay. But the problem is China's implementation, China's performance in these arenas, like human rights, like universal values, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan. Actually, their understanding are quite different from a lot of countries, including Japan, maybe including Brazil. So this is a great challenge. Let us not argue from, morally correct or not. China is qualified to pursue its own ways. That's okay. But the problem is the world is globalized. The world is converged. We need to narrow perception gaps to tackle the common challenges like climate change, like terrorism, like world economy. We need to get more consensus on what is human rights, what is righteous world or something like that. So this is quite important. So this is the reason why I'm trying to argue to, figure out what is China, what is China's democratization, what is Chinese political system, and this is quite important. And finally, let me say, I think US-China relations is the most consequential relation in the world now. And now, including Japan, we are standing at crossroads because now between US and China, this competition, strategic competition is more than economic, more than diplomatic, but political, ideological. So like Lee Hsien Loong, Singapore's prime minister said, we do not want to be forced to take a side, US or China, Japan as well. So this month, our Prime Minister, Mr. Suga, visited the United States and met with President Biden in person for the first time at the White House. And actually, our Prime Minister was trying to introduce Japanese different understanding on human rights. Maybe Japan and US, we could have a common sense on what is human rights. But when it comes to implementation or concrete actions on Xinjiang issue, maybe we would have different performance, because Japan's situation is different from the United States. So please understand, or something like that. But I think now we have to see, maybe including Brazil, maybe in the future, we are going to be forced to take a side, which one you belong to, US or China. And this is very unfortunate reality, because actually we cannot choose. For example, for Japan, of course, the alliance with the United States, this is a top priority for Japanese diplomacy, but we cannot sacrifice economic ties with China. Otherwise, a number of people would be dead in Japan, right? So this is the very important reality, maybe for the rest of the world. So that is why I would say US-China strategic rivalry would be the biggest uncertainty for the future of human beings. And this, why it is difficult and important is because this is more than economic. This is more than trade war. But what could be and what should be the fundamental factor of human beings in the future: democracy, freedom, human rights, dignity, political life. And now China is pursuing its own path. It's quite different from us, actually. So that is why I'm going to say China's political system, political discourse does matter. And this would affect the future discourse of human beings, international relations, much more than Indo-Pacific. That is why I'm trying to say, this is quite important to discuss. Okay, thank you. Let me stop here and let us interact and discuss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yosi. That was amazing.
Thank you.
Please, an applause.
So let's discuss.
Let's discuss, yes. Let's start. So it was extremely important, and the political dimension to the conversation that we were having since Monday, in particular, a strong message that is not just about economic power, but it's also thinking how the future of the world and the understanding of human beings and our future as a society, global society, will be considering these new Chinese global standards or these new ideas of Chinese democracy with Chinese characteristics. So I really, it's a great compliment with what we listened yesterday, and a lot of food for thought. Please, people, start writing your questions or comments in the chat, so I can start reading. For me, just to start, Josie, thank you for challenging me with the South-South cooperation angle. Sometimes I just look at the North-South division, but as you well said, it's more complex and more diverse than that. And it's every day getting more complex with different groups, regional groups, different arrangements, different interconnections between countries. So I think that is also an important point. I have a first question, which is, you said that now these standards, this standing of powerful Chinese standing in the world as a major power will mean now that China will set up new global standards and will be more assertive on setting up new global standards. My question is, do you really think, what are these standards? What do you sense will be this standard? Because so far I can see that they try to defend themselves and their own democratic system, but I'm not sure if they're as pushy as the West, to say, you need to do this at democratic level, you need to do these institutional reforms. Like, for example, we have suffered sometimes in Latin America, this imposition of standards in different ways, economic and political ways. So what are the Chinese standards that do you think that they will kind of start kind of imposing a little bit more in a Chinese way in the future?
Yes, Cecilia, thanks for a great question. And my very straightforward answer is, actually China at this moment, China is behaving very passively. China is not that confident on its own setting standard. Because China knows, as I mentioned, China knows, a lot of countries, a lot of, democracies, not only Western countries, but like Asian countries, like, Philippines or Vietnam. Actually, they do not trust China. They do not trust China's, political system, or China's economic behavior in Southeast Asia, including like AIIB or Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of people, including my friends in Africa, they say China just using money, to buy the trust, rather than contributing the confidence building or capacity building, labor markets in African continent. So a lot of capital, a lot of money to expand its own influence. But China has known this is not that convincing. But maybe when it comes to COVID-19, maybe a lot of countries or people would say, oh, China contains the virus very successfully. So in this sense, a kind of standard, lockdown, contain the virus very rapidly, and then very quickly move on to recovering economy, and then, producing masks, producing vaccine, and if possible, you can provide your vaccine to some developing countries or something like that. And China seems to be confident on this model, very limited area, to facing to the outbreak of COVID-19. So I would say, like Chinese spokesperson said, China had set a new standard, but what he said is China had set a new standard for the epidemic. He was not saying for global governance or world economy or democratic governance, no. China knows it's impossible at the moment. So I think now what the Chinese government doing, China knows you are different. You should increase your own trust and confidence with the rest of the world. That is why I would say China is behaving very possibly, very possibly. If you can set some standard, it's very, very limited area like pandemic. But I'm very doubtful on this as well. So
slowly, step by step, it's going to be a step-by-step process.
Yeah, step by step and up and down. And I do not think China's, future, looking forward, I think China's, engagement or China's engagement on global governance will be, very smooth. No, I think, we would see a lot of tensions between China and the rest of the world, even in economic areas. So let's see, and maybe for your understanding and thinking, I think a very interesting question on China is now very obviously Chinese politics is becoming much more conservative under Xi Jinping's era. But at the same time, China is trying to liberalize its economy. But the problem is that possible? Politically very conservative, but economically very liberalized. Is it possible? Is it possible? This is the question. I don't know. But this is what China, what Deng Xiaoping, maybe you have heard, Deng Xiaoping tried to do more than 40 years ago. China maintained socialism, but we can be open to marketing economy. But this what's happened for the first time in human history. Never happened in other places. But China has survived. China has developed. But from now on, maybe thanks to Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy, China took off economically. But whether China could be taking off politically, actually, this is my homework, my question,
Mhm.
whether China will democratize, but very closely related with economic modernization and
Mhm.
international engagement of China. This is my thinking.
Thank you so much. Gabriel, you raise your hands, and then I'm going to read the questions in the chat. So, Gabriel,
Good.
you want to?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for being here for your presentation. My question is thinking about Brazil. China is currently Brazil's biggest investor in many areas, including extractivism and um, exploring natural resources. But watchers, human rights watchers here in Brazil, now they see a tendency of as China grows economically here, there are also portions and flexibilizations of human rights legislations on labor and also environmental issues. So my question is, um, think that Chinese power now has come to such a force economically that you think that the tendency is to actually, flexibilize laws. China's economic power can override these values that are actually celebrated in the SDGs and internationally. I mean, that's kind of my question. Like,
Yeah.
you
Thank you, Gabriel. Did you hear well, Josie? Because it was a little bit the volume up and down. So, but did you
yeah,
understand, Josie?
yeah, and
Yeah,
he,
I understood. I understood
Okay,
basically.
okay, cool.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah,
you, Gabriel.
yeah. That's good. Thank you, Gabriel. That's a great question. I think not only Brazil, but a lot of countries, including Asia. When I visited Venezuela, even Venezuela, very different country, in Latin America, or Peru, Ecuador. Actually, I had chances to talk with local officials. Actually, they proposed different similar question. You know, we think for example, an economic bureaucrat in Ecuador told me, Chinese investment is huge. They have a lot of money. It looks very attractive, but it's so quick. We do not think China is understanding our own labor market or human rights or environmental conditions or something like that. But China just need money. We can invest very quickly, very huge. Just listen to us, something like that, right? I think China is learning a lot from a lot of failures in Latin America, in Southeast Asia. Actually, China has failed a lot. You know, China, for example, China borrowed a huge money, but without any conditions, But they couldn't have any returns from local government or private sectors. But maybe China, at that time, Chinese government or Chinese companies were driven by its political or strategic motivations. And they even could sacrifice economic profits. But from now on, these factors, including you mentioned, economic capacity and your understanding and commitment on human rights and your relation with, Congress, your relation with the local community, these are, the comprehensive. These should be considered comprehensively. Maybe human rights, global governance, or democratic governance, like Cecilia has engaged over the years. So China should have learned a lot from their own failures. And I can tell you, China has known a lot. China has never ignored this issue. China knows how serious, how difficult their engagement or performance with the local community have been. So, but maybe sometimes, a lot of companies or private sectors or SOEs, they have to earn money very quickly. very quickly, and they make a point of political achievement a lot because they have to show to Beijing's government, oh, we did a lot, we earned money, we convinced the local government, or they need this kind of political achievement. That is why they neglect a lot of technical issues, or including very fundamental issues like human rights. But from now on, things will be changed. What I can tell you here is China has been aware very deeply. So let's focus on their behavior from now on. Yeah. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Yosi. So Victor, and we have several questions and only 3 minutes left.
Sorry.
Who wants to stay 5 more minutes?
I spoke too much. Sorry.
No, you can you stay a few more minutes, Yosi, or you need to go?
Even 1 hour, that's fine for me.
No, but, maybe at least we can try to stay 10 more minutes if people agree. Yeah. Okay, cool. So Victor is saying, Yosi, do you think there are any other countries in the world that are reaching or want to adopt the Chinese model? And do you think if there is a genocide policy against the Uyghur in Xinjiang?
I think, as I mentioned, when our Prime Minister of Japan, Suga, discussed with President Biden at the White House on Xinjiang Uyghur issue, as far as I know, they did not talk about genocide, but they did talk about human rights in Xinjiang, and the Chinese government should respect human rights and the religious freedom of Uyghur minorities. But when it comes to economic or business sectors, maybe there will be different performance between Japanese businessman and the American businessman or something like that. I think like US former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, oh, this is genocide. And Anthony Blinken, the current US Secretary of State, yeah, he said this is genocide. And looking at UK Congress, as far as I know, a lot of politicians, parties, they say, oh, this is genocide. And if China does not make a point of our concerns, we are going to impose some sanctions on the issues. This is my understanding on the current situation. I think different countries, different government, different political parties would have and could have different position, because this is a super complicated issue. What is genocide? What is genocide? As far as I know, the American government just defined the former Ottoman Empire behavior on Armenia, that was genocide. And Turkish government, Erdogan said, oh, it's not acceptable for us, something like that. So this is not just between US and China, but this is all about, international politics. And sometimes it's regard to political profits. It's regard to, human rights, right? And political correctness sometimes. So I think it depends. For example, Japanese very famous company, Uniqlo. Have you heard Uniqlo? Uniqlo, Japanese, very, very, very influential apparel company, and actually very, 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 very influential in China. But when the CEO of this company faced press conference and he was asked about this issue, what do you think about Xinjiang's human rights issue? And the CEO said, no comment, no comment. I am neutral as a head of huge company. Only what I can do is I am neutral politically. I have never talked about politics. I'm doing my business. Yeah, that's okay for him. He is not against the law, right? He is not against constitution. No. Of course, I have my own understanding. I hopefully China could respect Uyghurs' human rights and political freedom. And then eventually China could have achieved more respects and trusts from the rest of the world. This is what I want. But whether you define genocide or not, it depends. It depends on different players and different government. This is my understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yosi. Yeah, I invite everyone to read if they're interested on the different controversies and fights in regard to what it means genocide. There is a lot of literature about that. It is very complicated, as Yosi said.
But Cecilia, I think, but what is important is we should maintain open-minded. We should listen to different opinions. We should respect different opinions, different values. You shouldn't be exclusive.
Yeah.
You shouldn't close your own heart. This is a basic attitude for living in the globalized area. This is my understanding.
Exactly. Openness. Good.
Openness.
I love it. Luisa is saying, do you think that future multilateral agreements led by China would have less conditionalities and less interventions? That seems to be the in Africa with their investment. What do you think of these conditionalities discussion?
Yes, that's a great question. When China, sometimes Chinese company or Chinese SOEs invest in Latin America or Southeast Asia, they always emphasize we do not have any conditionality. I can invest you, I can borrow you without any conditions. But for example, in Japan, we would say this is the biggest condition.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Why?
In other words, you say, for example, if this investment project hurts environment, hurts labor balance, labor ecosystem in local community, as a result, this would arise a nightmare, right? So a lot of people in Japan, we do not buy this argument. China always say we can give you without any condition. No. This is not responsible way. You should have condition, environment, human rights, labor market, term, government relations, and the relation with local government, central government, local people. We need to assess very carefully. It takes time, right? But we need to have, very careful assessment, very careful, evaluation. So I think any investment for in the future. But so this is why, Japanese, like, JICA, Japanese ODA, Official Development Assistant. We encountered a lot of criticism. You are too slow. You always taking time. But this means stability. Step by step, because it should take a lot of process. We need to assess its impact on local community. So maybe pros and cons. China is very quick, very speedy. Japan is very slow, but Japan is much safer. China is much risky. It may be pros and cons, but I think from now on, China should propose its own condition. This is what we should protect. This is what we should agree or disagree, rather than I can give you without any condition. No. This is not a responsibility. This is my understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why it's so good to have Yosi, because we have similar and different ideas, you see. So it's a good complement. We have to keep each other open, always think about openness. So Kao is saying, thank you, first of all, it was a great presentation. My question is, do you think that with the Chinese rise as a major actor, they will change their interest and start to expand to as a new possible alternative to Western democracy as a model? Do you think that they will offer their model as a something, new and different from the Western democracy globally at some point?
That is very good question. Very good question, and very critical and fundamental. And this is exactly what I was trying to figure out in my book. I would say, if I have to say yes or no, I would say no. I would say no. Whatever we say, China model or democracy with Chinese characteristics or whatever, China say socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? socialist democracy with Chinese characteristics. Would it be alternative to liberal democracies? If, let me answer, I would say no. I think because, looking at liberal democracies, at least more than, a number of countries, including Japan, maybe including Brazil, we are, learning, referring, following, comparing, but anyway, we respect basic fundamental aspects of liberal democracy, but we could have different implementations, right? But we could have common sense. What is democracy? So this is very potential to expand, very potential to deepen beyond the region, beyond the time. But China, I would say China could create a completely different political system and survive for a long time. It's possible. It's possible. But when it comes to alternativeness, it should be copied by other countries. You cannot say it is only for China. If you are becoming a kind of alternative to liberal democracy, this political system shouldn't be only China, but maybe North Korea, maybe Cuba, maybe Venezuela, but it couldn't be only 4, maybe at least maybe 10 or 20. In this sense, I would say China's model, China's political system basically are just happening in China. It is very difficult to copy. It is very, very difficult to copy. Nobody could replace Chinese Communist Party. It's a very unique political party. But we have a lot of reason to respect that, to respect China's achievement. But it's a different question to talk about whether it could be alternative to liberal democracy or whether it could be copied by other countries. No, it is quite difficult. It's a different question. Yes.
That's excellent. Okay, last 2 questions from Mariana.
Okay.
It was a very interesting. Many governments attempted to adopt a socialist communist regime, but they became totalitarian, brewing corruption and deceleration of the GDP. Seeing China as a centralized government and now with Xi Jinping with more power, what do you think that the Chinese government, how do you think that the Chinese government managed to remain successful, and how do they were successful in become, and the GDP, I mean growing GDP without becoming fully totalitarian or slowing down progress? So it's a complicated, but basically other communist parties had the different effects. They go down in corruption, totalitarianism, lowering down the GDP, and China is the opposite. How did it happen?
Yeah. When Xi Jinping took office in 2012, Xi Jinping saw what is the biggest problem for the Chinese Communist Party: corruption. Corrupted government is the biggest problem, because corrupted government indispensably, eventually loses trust from the people. If the people does not trust the government in this undemocratic political system, you could be nothing. Your regime would be turned over. History would be repeating. This is how Chinese history has worked, right? Always, emperor and the people. Emperor say, oh, democracy, stability, or economy, growth, wealth. But when you are corrupted, people stood up and turn it over. This is how Chinese history has worked repeatedly, right? So my basic understanding is China is still on that history. If Chinese government is corrupted, or you cannot maintain its own economy or stability, people would stand up and turn it over. So I would say here, maybe a bit sounds exaggerating, but the history would be repeated. So China is still surviving in this historic cycle. This is my basic understanding. But now under Xi Jinping's era, the problem is now, including the United States, international society, we are, imposing a lot of diplomatic pressure on China. And then eventually Xi Jinping has got more approval from its own people. So now the people in China, they are supporting Xi Jinping. Yeah, Xi Jinping, consolidated its own power, personal cult. Xi Jinping has too much power. It's over consolidated. It shouldn't be like that. But the problem is now people support Xi Jinping. And now looking at Chinese economy, Chinese political stability, it is improving. Social justice, social welfare, only politics, only human rights. So the problem is, okay, the Chinese Communist Party could maintain relatively clean government, good governance, not democratic, but good governance, and stability, growth, wealth, living of standards, improving increasingly. But when your economy is in trouble, when your life or people are in trouble, how do you convince your own people to listen to me without any political reform? This is the biggest problem. And I would say this situation would be happen within 10 years.
Okay.
So when economy is no longer working, your good governance is no longer convincing, how could you convince your own people to listen to you? Maybe so let us focus on this issue in next 10 years. Thank you.
So we can do another webinar in 10 years and see if your prediction was right, Yosi. And see if it was, okay, last question, and then we leave you go. We know it's your birthday. Yes. So the last question is for around global warming. And what is your opinion about China's position in regards to global warming? If it will be the biggest investor in green energies in territories inside China, but also in other countries. And what do you think if this is going to be the main fight between China and the United States?
Okay. China now at the moment is the largest CO2 emissioner, right? And but as I mentioned, now between US and China, this is a strategic competition. Basically, from human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, most of them are competitive. Basically, very difficult to see any cooperations. But climate change era for US and China. Like John Kerry, former Secretary of State, visited Shanghai, and Xi Jinping attended the climate summit hosted by President Biden, right? So climate change could be only cooperative area for US-China strategic rivalry. This is first point. Second, China thinks, when it comes to, political area like human rights or, democratic governance, China and Chinese Communist Party, they know it is very difficult to be respected. It is very difficult to be trusted. But climate change could be a kind civilization in the world. But when we look at China's domestic, objectives, China says until 2030, 9 years later, the scale of carbon emission would be the peak. And then before 2060, they could realize the carbon neutral. So I would say, it takes time. And, very interestingly speaking, China says our contribution to global warming, climate change should be common. Our responsibility should be shared, but at the same time should be differentiated. You are a developed country, US, Japan, Europe. You are industrialized and developed country. So you should take more responsibility on that. And we, developing country, we have to grow. We have to, grow our economy. That is why we are allowed to have more rights to sacrificing climates, because we are, backward. We need to develop. That is why you should take more responsibility, please, United States, President Biden. So this is very interesting and ambivalent issue. China is trying to expand its global leadership on climate change, but at the same time, maybe China is trying to avoid the responsibility. So this is very, tricky logic. Climate change for China means very ambivalent issues. For China, this is an arena which could be exercising global leadership with cooperation with the United States. But at the same time, China defines himself as the largest developing country. So we can take less responsibility on that. So China is trying to avoid the global responsibility. So it's a relationship between leadership and responsibility. So this is a great case to assess what does the rise of China mean. So let's focus and discuss in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's meet in 10 years. Yosi, big applause for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I learned a lot. Julia, can you stop recording, please? We want to tell you something now out of the record.